My name is Evelyn Carter, and my existence was permanently divided into two distinct realities by a single long-distance phone call that arrived at 3 in the morning. The digital screen displayed an unlisted corporate number from an aviation tracking firm located in London. The voice on the other end was clinical and devoid of human empathy as it informed me that the Gulfstream G650, private jet belonging to my fiancé, Adrian Vale, had vanished from radar screens over the dark waters of the North Atlantic. They used phrases like catastrophic mid-air decompression and structural disintegration, but my mind could only focus on the memory of his hand resting on my shoulder just 5 hours earlier before he boarded that silver machine. I stood alone in our minimalist glass penthouse overlooking the skyline of Manhattan, the silence of the room becoming a physical weight that pressed down on my chest until I could no longer draw a complete breath. The police and the aviation authorities arrived before dawn to secure his personal files and his financial records, treating me not as a grieving woman, but as a potential liability in a multi-billion-dollar corporate empire. I watched the sunrise over the river through a veil of absolute numbness, realizing that the future we had meticulously designed together had been completely erased in a single fraction of a second. Adrian Vale was not merely a wealthy investor. He was a structural titan whose financial movements influenced international markets and redefined urban landscapes across 3 different continents. As an architectural restoration specialist, I had spent my entire career breathing new life into historical stone structures that the world had forgotten, which was precisely how I met Adrian during his high-profile acquisition of an 18th-century estate in upstate New York. He possessed a hyper-controlled charisma that drew people into his orbit while simultaneously keeping them at an unbridgeable distance. A man who could command a boardroom of cynical executives with a whisper, but who always locked a section of his own mind away from the world. Our relationship was built on a foundation of luxury penthouses and private gallery viewings, a world where every dinner was a choreographed event and every vacation was protected by non-disclosure agreements. Yet beneath the velvet security of that life, I often felt a subtle undercurrent of danger, an unspoken reality that Adrian was constantly running from a shadow that he refused to name or acknowledge. The grief did not arrive as a sudden wave, but as a slow, corrosive poison that filled the empty spaces of the apartment we had shared for the last 2 years. The media coverage of the crash was relentless, every news anchor projecting images of the Atlantic Ocean while speculating on the massive financial vacuum left by the sudden demise of a billionaire tycoon. Adrian's corporate lawyers moved with terrifying speed, freezing our joint accounts and changing the security codes on his private offices within 48 hours of the official declaration of death. They handed me a sterile cardboard box containing the personal items he had left behind at the firm, a collection of gold cufflinks and custom fountain pens that felt entirely alien in my trembling hands. I sat on the floor of the master bedroom surrounded by his tailored suits, realizing that despite our impending marriage, I possessed no legal right to his legacy and no answers to the questions that were beginning to rot my sanity. My obsession with the truth did not begin with Adrian. It was a dormant infection inherited from my mother, who had vanished without a trace 20 years earlier when I was just a teenager. She had been an investigative researcher focusing on illegal offshore banking networks, a woman who spent her nights surrounded by microfilms and translated bank ledgers until the night she walked out of our home and never returned. The police had dismissed her case as a voluntary disappearance, a narrative that fractured my family and forced me to build an emotional fortress around my own heart. Finding Adrian had been the first time I allowed myself to believe that the world could be safe, that a man could offer me an unshakable sanctuary from the ghosts of my past. Now, as I looked at the empty space beside me in the bed, I realized that the universe had simply repeated its favorite cruelty, leaving me with another unsolved vanishing to dissect until there was nothing left of my mind. 3 days after the official memorial service in New York, I packed a single suitcase and caught a commercial flight to Paris under the pretense of evaluating a historic theater restoration project in the Marais district. The truth was that I could no longer endure the suffocating sympathy of Manhattan society, a world that looked at my pale face and saw nothing but a tragic headline. I checked into a boutique hotel near the Place Vendôme, spending my days walking through the autumn rain until my boots were soaked through and my mind was entirely exhausted. On the 3rd evening, I entered the lobby of the ultra-luxury Grand Hotel de l'Opéra to meet a local historical consultant, the air inside the venue thick with the scent of expensive lilies and old wealth. I stood near the gold-trimmed elevators waiting for my contact when the center car hissed open, and a man stepped out into the bright light of the lobby. The man was wearing a dark charcoal overcoat that had been custom-tailored to fit his exact physical frame. His stride was measured and arrogant, a flawless replica of the physical presence I had buried in my mind. It was Adrian. There was no room for error in the geometry of his face or the specific way his silver watch caught the ambient light of the chandelier. My heart slammed against my ribs with such violence that I dropped my leather notebook, the pages scattering across the marble floor as I ran toward him through the crowded lobby. I called his name, my voice cracking with a mixture of terror and manic hope that caused several hotel guests to turn around in surprise. He stopped dead in his tracks, turning his head slowly toward me as I reached out to touch the heavy wool of his sleeve, his eyes locking onto mine with the cold vacancy of a total stranger. "I am sorry, mademoiselle, but you have mistaken me for someone else." His voice was smooth and perfectly articulated with a slight continental accent that differed completely from the American cadence I knew by heart. I stared at him, my fingers trembling against his coat as I searched his face for any sign of recognition, any hidden flicker of the love that had defined our private lives for 2 years. There was nothing but a polite annoyance, the distant courtesy of a billionaire diplomat who was accustomed to dealing with unstable women in public spaces. Before I could speak, a security detail in matching black suits stepped between us, gently but firmly guiding me backward, while Adrian turned and walked out the rotating glass doors into the Parisian night. I collapsed onto a nearby velvet sofa, my mind spinning into a dangerous vertigo as the hotel staff looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. I returned to my own hotel room in a state of complete psychological collapse, locking the deadbolt and sitting against the door as the rain lashed against the window panes. I stayed in the dark for hours, questioning my own sanity and wondering if the trauma of the crash had finally triggered a psychotic break that made me see ghosts in the faces of strangers. At midnight, a soft scraping sound broke the silence of the room, a sharp plastic friction occurring at the base of the door where it met the carpet. I froze, my eyes adjusting to the shadows as I saw a thin rectangular object slide through the narrow gap from the exterior hallway. I crawled forward on my hands and knees, my breath catching in my throat as my fingers made contact with a white hotel keycard that was smeared with a dark, sticky residue that I instantly recognized as dried blood. On the face of the plastic card, someone had scratched a single room number with a sharp instrument. Room 714. The transition from a dangerous survival alliance into a permanent state of peace occurred in the high mountain passes of the Swiss Alps, where Luca and I established our long-term research base. The international warrants for the remaining members of the conspiracy were processed by global law enforcement, ensuring that the financial architecture Adrian had fought to expose would never be rebuilt. We sat in the library of a restored stone villa, looking out at the snow-covered peaks, the warmth of the wood stove illuminating the microfilms and the original bank ledgers that my mother had died to protect. Luca reached across the table, his fingers closing over mine, with an authentic warmth that signaled the complete resolution of the long war we had waged against the ghosts of our past. I knew that our love had been forged in the shadows of Room 714, a dangerous beginning that had ultimately led us to a sanctuary of absolute truth and sovereignty. I swiped the blood-covered card through the electronic reader, the small indicator light shifting from a predatory red to a pale, welcoming green with a distinct mechanical click. I pushed the door open into absolute darkness, the air inside the suite heavy with the scent of expensive cologne and the unmistakable undertone of chemical cleaning agents. I located the light switch, illuminating a lavish parlor room that had been completely ransacked, every drawer emptied onto the floor and the silk curtains slashed by a precise blade. In the center of the king-size bed lay a leather briefcase that I recognized as Adrian's personal property. Its gold combination locks busted open, and its interior compartments lined with shredded financial documents. Beneath the briefcase on the white linen sheet, someone had written a single name in black marker: Luca Moretti. The search for Luca Moretti led me away from Paris within 12 hours, my intuition directing me toward a small independent press archive located in the heart of Rome near the Piazza Navona. Luca was an investigative journalist whose reputation was defined by a cynical brilliance and a complete disregard for his own personal safety, a man who had spent a decade exposing corporate corruption across southern Europe. I found him sitting in a subterranean office surrounded by stacks of vintage newspapers and flickering computer monitors, his dark hair disheveled and his eyes carrying the weary intensity of a perpetual outsider. When I mentioned Adrian's name and showed him the bloodied keycard, he did not mock my narrative or suggest I contact the embassy. He simply locked the entrance door and pulled up a heavy wooden chair. Adrian Vale did not die in that ocean explosion. Evelyn, Luca said as he illuminated a massive digital diagram on his main monitor, displaying a web of shell companies stretching from the Cayman Islands to Luxembourg. He explained that Adrian had spent the last 5 years discovering a secret financial syndicate known as the Sovereign Horizon, an organization that laundered billions of dollars through high-profile art auctions and luxury charitable foundations. The private jet explosion was a coordinated execution meant to eliminate Adrian before he could deliver an unredacted ledger to international prosecutors. But someone inside the system had leaked the flight coordinates ahead of time. Luca looked at me with a soft, dangerous intensity, warning me that by carrying that keycard, I had automatically become a target for the same cleaning crews that had sanitized room 714. Our conversation was violently terminated by the sound of breaking glass from the upper street level, followed by the heavy rhythmic footsteps of 2 men entering the archive's main stairwell. Luca acted instantly, grabbing my arm and pulling me through a narrow brick archway that led into the ancient catacomb system beneath the Roman printing press. We moved through the damp darkness without flashlights, our hands scraping against the ancient volcanic stone as the sounds of muffled gunshots echoed through the printing floor above us. In that narrow underground passage, pressed against the cold earth as Luca held his breath beside me, the reality of my old life dissolved completely. I was no longer an architect restoring dead buildings. I was a living piece of evidence in a global war where the borders between life and death were managed by corporate assassins. We escaped Rome via a night train heading north towards Milan, our identities masked by false documents that Luca had secured through his network of anti-corruption activists. The slow-burn chemistry between us began to develop in those narrow train compartments, our shared danger creating an intimacy that felt both terrifying and entirely necessary. Luca spent hours analyzing the shredded documents I had salvaged from room 714, his fingers occasionally brushing against mine as he pointed out recurring transaction codes linked to an estate in the Scottish Highlands. I watched his profile against the dark window pane, realizing that this cynical journalist with the soft eyes was the only entity keeping me anchored to reality while my fiancé performed a cold masquerade across Europe. The Scotland codes directed our investigation towards Celeste Laurent, an international fashion mogul whose luxury boutiques served as the primary physical fronts for the syndicate's laundering operations. Celeste was Adrian's former lover, a woman who weaponized elegance and managed her corporate empire with the ruthless efficiency of a military commander. We infiltrated her private gallery exhibition in Edinburgh, a high society event where the elite of Europe gathered to admire avant-garde sculptures while drinking vintage champagne. I watched Celeste move through the room in an emerald silk dress, her laughter light and melodic while her eyes scanned the crowd with the calculating gaze of a predator checking its territory. When Celeste noticed me approaching her through the exhibition hall, her expression did not register shock or alarm. She merely gestured for her security team to step back and poured 2 glasses of white wine. "You shouldn't be here, Evelyn," she whispered as she guided me toward a private terrace overlooking the dark stone of Edinburgh Castle, her voice carrying a seductive poison. She told me that Adrian's fake death was a mutual arrangement designed to save his corporate assets from complete seizure, claiming that he had willingly abandoned me to protect his own survival. She suggested that if I continued to let Luca Moretti drag me through the mud of this investigation, my ending would match the violent fate of my mother. I stepped back from Celeste as Luca appeared at the edge of the terrace, his hand resting inside his coat pocket where he carried a compact recording device. Celeste laughed at our defiance, revealing a piece of information that shattered my trust in the entire investigation like a heavy hammer hitting a mirror. She looked at Luca and asked him if he had told Evelyn about the original contract he signed with the Sovereign Horizon before he conveniently met her in Rome. I turned to look at Luca, the rain beginning to fall over the stone terrace as I saw the sudden agony of guilt manifest in his eyes. Realizing that my investigative savior had entered my life under orders from the very network I was trying to destroy. We left the Edinburgh Gallery in a bitter silence, the rain soaking our clothes as we walked through the cobblestone alleys of the old town without looking at each other. Inside our hidden safe house, Luca dropped to his knees before me, his voice cracking with an authentic desperation as he admitted that the syndicate had initially paid him to monitor my movements. But I fell in love with you for real, Evelyn, he said, his soft eyes filled with a raw vulnerability that I had never seen in Adrian's hyper-controlled presence. He explained that the moment he realized the syndicate intended to murder me, he tore up the contract and dedicated his life to destroying them, choosing to become an exile alongside the woman he was supposed to betray. The emotional fracture between us was healed by a shared discovery located inside an old leather trunk that my mother had left in a Swiss safety deposit box 20 years earlier. Luca had tracked the account number through his old investigative files, risking his life to retrieve the contents while I remained hidden in a mountain cabin. Inside the box lay a handwritten diary and a collection of photographic negatives showing Celeste, Laurent and my father Charles Carter operating a rudimentary version of the laundering network in 2006. My mother had not walked out on our family. She had been systematically silenced by the same corporate alliance because she refused to let them use her architectural firm to mask their offshore transactions. Armed with my mother's ledger, we coordinated a high-risk meeting with a senior director of the Swiss Federal Intelligence Service who promised us diplomatic protection in exchange for the original documents. The rendezvous was set for a secluded pier on Lake Geneva at dusk, the water reflecting the gray autumn sky as Luca and I waited near a closed boathouse. Instead of an intelligence director, a black limousine rolled onto the gravel path, and the rear window slid down to reveal the pale aristocratic face of Adrian Vale. He looked at me with an intense obsessive warmth that made my skin run cold, his voice returning to its original American cadence as he commanded me to get into the vehicle before Celeste's cleaners closed the perimeter. I stood between two men on that rain-swept pier, Luca holding a loaded pistol inside his trench coat and Adrian offering me an exit strategy backed by billions of dollars in hidden offshore reserves. Adrian revealed that every calculated move he made since the jet explosion was executed to keep me alive, claiming that his public rejection of me in Paris was a necessary piece of theater to divert Celeste's suspicion. He looked at Luca with absolute corporate disdain, revealing that the journalist's original contract was signed with Celeste herself to frame Adrian for my mother's historical murder. I looked at the two men, realizing that my entire adult life had been an architectural blueprint designed by two different masters who were both obsessed with my survival for entirely different reasons. Adrian opened the limousine door further, displaying a medical file from a private neurological clinic in Zurich that detailed a terminal degenerative condition affecting his central nervous system. He had been poisoned during an assassination attempt in London 3 years earlier, an attack that left him with less than 6 months of cognitive lucidity before absolute paralysis set in. "Everything I did was against time, Evelyn," he whispered, his hyper-controlled facade cracking for the first time to reveal an immense ocean of sorrow underneath. He had staged the jet crash to trigger a massive corporate restructuring that would automatically transfer his entire wealth to my personal foundations, bypassing the syndicate's ability to freeze his assets. Before I could make my impossible choice, a volley of high-caliber automatic gunfire tore through the boathouse walls, wood splinters and shattered glass raining down over the gravel path. Luca tackled me to the ground, using his body as a shield as Adrian's security detail returned fire against a team of tactical operators wearing unmarked black gear. Adrian screamed my name from inside the armored vehicle, but Luca dragged me toward a waiting motorboat tied to the edge of the pier, its engine roaring to life as the gunfire intensified. We launched into the dark waters of Lake Geneva as the limousine was engulfed in an explosion, leaving Adrian's fate unresolved once again as the Swiss shoreline dissolved into a haze of smoke and fire. We spent the next 48 hours hiding in the abandoned railway tunnels beneath the city of Lausanne, our bodies exhausted and our resources reduced to a single laptop and my mother's original diary. The slow-burn intimacy between Luca and me reached its absolute peak in that damp darkness, our survival dependent on a mutual trust that had been purified by the fire of the pier attack. He tended to a shrapnel wound on my shoulder with gentle, trembling hands, his eyes reflecting a deep emotional commitment that required no corporate galas or luxury penthouses to validate its existence. I realized that while Adrian loved me like a rare architectural monument to be protected in a vault, Luca loved me like a living person who had the right to fight alongside him. Using the laptop and Luca's remaining journalist contacts, we initiated a coordinated digital transmission that broadcast my mother's ledger and the Room 714 files to every major financial newsroom in the world. The response was immediate and catastrophic for the sovereign horizon. International banking regulators initiated emergency freezes on all luxury foundations linked to Celeste Laurent within 6 hours. Celeste attempted to flee Scotland via her private helicopter, but she was intercepted by federal agents on the tarmac of an airfield near Aberdeen, her fashion empire collapsing into a permanent state of criminal liquidation. With Celeste in custody and the syndicate dismantled, the state authorities granted us full immunity and returned my mother's original assets to my legal control. I walked through the empty rooms of our old Manhattan penthouse one final time, looking at the luxury furniture and the glass walls that had once felt like a secure sanctuary, but now resembled a beautiful mausoleum. Adrian had survived the pier explosion, but his neurological decline had accelerated, leaving him confined to a private medical facility in the mountains where he could no longer recognize his own name. He had won his war against time and secured my financial future, but he had lost the woman he built the fortress to protect. 2 months after the collapse of the syndicate, I traveled back to the ancestral stone fortress in the Scottish Highlands that Adrian had purchased during our first year together. The property was now legally mine, a historic estate surrounded by mist-covered lochs and ancient pine forests that felt entirely separated from the violence of our past. I walked into the great hall beneath the historic stone arches, the warmth of a roaring hearthfire illuminating the emerald ring on my finger that Luca had given me during our flight through Switzerland. The structural peace of the room was absolute, a silent monument to the survival of 2 people who had broken through the highest circles of international deception. Luca joined me at the window, his hand resting on my waist with a calm, secure warmth that carried no hidden agendas or corporate secrets. We looked out at the dark waters of the loch, realizing that our love had successfully completed its transition from a dangerous survival alliance into a permanent state of structural harmony. The ghosts of my mother's disappearance and Adrian's obsession had been laid to rest beneath the stone foundations of this new life, leaving us with nothing but the open horizon of our own design. We dedicated our lives to transforming the Highland Fortress into a permanent archive for investigative journalists and human rights researchers seeking to expose offshore corporate manipulation. The files from Room 714 and my mother's diary were preserved in a climate-controlled vault beneath the library, a permanent warning to the financial titans who believed they could manage human lives like line items on a spreadsheet. Every evening we sat together in the quiet hall, our shared silence becoming a beautiful, unshakable architecture that no conspiracy could ever hope to dismantle. Before settling permanently in Scotland, I made one final journey to Paris to visit the Grand Hotel de l'Opéra, where the apparition had first fractured my reality. I stood in front of the door to room 714, the mahogany wood now clean and polished, the old electronic lock replaced by a modern biometric system. I did not feel fear or vertigo as I looked at the brass numbers. I felt only a profound sense of closure for the woman I had been when I first swiped that blood-covered card. I turned and walked toward the elevators, my boots echoing with a steady, confident rhythm that signaled my complete departure from the cage of the past. The financial fallout from the exposure of the sovereign horizon triggered an unprecedented audit across 40 different luxury brands and art houses throughout Western Europe. I watched the live broadcasts from our Highland library as CEOs and offshore asset managers were led out of their glass headquarters in handcuffs, their names permanently erased from the social registries they had spent decades manipulating. Luca compiled the data into a definitive text titled The Architecture of Deception, ensuring that the structural mechanics of their laundering system would be taught in every criminal justice university on the planet. Our victory was not celebrated with champagne or public galas. It was recognized in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the systemic machinery that murdered my mother could never operate in the dark again. In the spring of 2026, Luca and I traveled to a secluded sanitarium near Locarno, where Adrian Vale spent his final weeks under an assumed name to protect his remaining dignity from the paparazzi. He sat in a wheelchair on a sun-drenched terrace overlooking Lake Maggiore, his physical form immaculately groomed, but his brilliant analytical mind entirely reclaimed by the neurological degeneration. When I sat beside him and placed my hand over his, he did not speak or manifest any sign of recognition, his vacant gaze fixed on the flight of alpine birds over the water. I wept silently for the tragic architecture of his life, a man who possessed the intelligence to build a financial empire, but lacked the temporal currency to enjoy the simple peace of being loved. Adrian's legal executors delivered a final encrypted document to my terminal 3 days after his quiet passing, a digital manifesto written during his last month of cognitive lucidity in Zurich. The text revealed that he had known about Luca Moretti's original contract with Celeste from the very beginning, purposefully allowing the journalist to approach me because he knew Luca possessed the raw survival instincts needed to protect me when the jet exploded. He had orchestrated his own betrayal to ensure that I would be left in the custody of a man who could not be bought by the syndicate, an act of supreme cold calculated sacrifice that redefined my understanding of his obsession. I closed the file and looked at Luca, who was chopping wood outside in the courtyard, realizing that Adrian's final investment had been the purchase of my absolute freedom. The alignment of our lives became complete when the Swiss government officially restored my mother's maiden name to the Historical Preservation Society she had founded in Geneva before her disappearance. I attended the ceremony wearing a simple black coat, standing alongside Luca as the director unveiled a bronze plaque dedicated to her investigative bravery. The public validation was a cold comfort compared to the 20 years of absence I had endured. But as I looked at the plaque, I felt a deep structural weight lift from my shoulders. The line of maternal trauma had been broken, replaced by a legacy of unyielding resistance that I would carry into every restoration project I ever initiated. Luca's reputation as an untouchable journalist grew exponentially following the publication of the Horizon Files, transforming him into a primary structural shield for independent researchers across Europe. Our Highland fortress became a physical sanctuary where young writers could verify sensitive financial data without fear of surveillance or sudden corporate retaliation. He maintained his cynical edge in his writing, but when he returned to our private quarters, his eyes held only the soft domestic peace that he had discovered during our nights in the Lausanne railway tunnels. We had built a life out of the wreckage of a billionaire's conspiracy, proving that the most resilient structures are those built by two people who have looked into the dark together. During a brief journey to Amsterdam to recover a collection of my mother's translated bank ledgers, Luca and I found ourselves followed by a silver sedan through the narrow streets near the Prinsengracht Canal. The old adrenaline surfaced instantly, my muscles tightening as we ducked into a crowded canal-side cafe to evaluate our strategic options. Luca checked the perimeter with his practiced analytical gaze, his hand resting securely over mine as he confirmed that the individuals tracking us were not syndicate cleaners, but federal protective agents assigned by the state to guarantee our safety. We laughed at our own residual paranoia, a sweet shared moment that proved how deeply the trauma of Room 714 had been etched into our physical reflexes. I returned to my professional practice in the summer of 2026, accepting a massive contract to restore an ancient stone cathedral located in the north of Scotland that had been damaged by a centuries-old fire. The work was physically exhausting, requiring me to spend hours on wooden scaffolding, analyzing the structural integrity of historical arches, while the North Sea wind howled through the open stone windows. Luca often sat below on the granite floor with his laptop, his presence a constant stabilizing anchor that allowed me to focus on rebuilding what time had degraded. I realized that my work as an architect was a perfect metaphor for my psychological recovery, a systematic process of replacing broken stone with resilient material while honoring the original design. The last remaining shell company of the Sovereign Horizon was officially liquidated by international liquidators in July 2026, its assets distributed to global charities focusing on victims of white-collar exploitation. Celeste Laurent's high-fashion boutiques were reorganized under a public trust, their luxury interiors stripped of the dark financial infrastructure that had defined their hidden operations. I watched the final corporate report disappear from the news streams, realizing that the massive matrix that had caged my family for 2 decades had finally been reduced to zero state. The world had moved on to new headlines, but the architecture of our survival remained unshakable beneath the Scottish sky. Luca and I spent our winter evenings transcribing the audio recordings he had secured. During our infiltration of the Edinburgh Gallery and the Genevan Pier, the voices of Celeste and Adrian echoed through the quiet library, their calculated words sounding like historical artifacts from an era of absolute moral bankruptcy. We filed the digital audio files into the public trust database, ensuring that no future financial tycoon could ever use the same legal loopholes to mask their illicit operations. When the final file was compiled, Luca closed the database terminal, his fingers intertwining with mine as we sat in the warmth of the roaring hearth fire. The stone walls of our Highland home stood firm against the winter blizzards, a physical manifestation of the sovereign covenant we had established during our run across Europe. I had spent my entire life looking for a sanctuary that could protect me from the ghosts of my mother's disappearance and Adrian's hyper-controlled obsession. In the quiet domestic reality I had built with Luca, I realized that sanctuary is not a geographic location or a luxury penthouse protected by security codes. Sanctuary is the unshakable emotional intimacy that develops between two people who have chosen to speak the truth, regardless of the cost. I kept the blood-stained keycard from room 714 inside a small glass case on my office desk, a historical anchor that reminded me of the night my old reality dissolved completely. Visitors often asked about the plastic card with the scratched numbers, assuming it was a modern art piece salvaged from one of my urban restoration projects. I always smiled and told them it was the key to an architectural puzzle that took 2 years and 3 deaths to solve, a private truth that required no further elaboration. It was the artifact of my transition, the precise point where the woman who ran from shadows became the woman who dictated her own design. The international journalism community awarded Luca their highest honor for his exposure of the Sovereign Horizon financial architecture during a ceremony in London. He did not attend the gala in person, choosing instead to transmit a brief, pre-recorded video message from our library in the Scottish Highlands. He dedicated the award to Evelyn Carter and her mother, the two women whose architectural blueprints and historical ledgers had provided the raw evidence needed to break the syndicate. I watched him from behind the camera lens, my heart swelling with a deep, permanent love for this dangerous man with the soft eyes who had helped me survive the wreck. Our life in Scotland settled into a beautiful, predictable cadence. Our days occupied by architectural restoration projects, historical research, and long walks through the heather-covered hills. We had no private jets or luxury penthouses to distance us from the realities of the world, but we possessed a total emotional security that money could never hope to finance. The road ahead was uncharted and entirely free of corporate manipulation, a clean slate of white paper waiting for the first lines of our shared future. I knew that whatever challenges materialized in the shadows of the horizon, our alliance was permanently compiled and unshakable. The final legal disputes regarding Adrian Vale's multi-billion-dollar corporate estate were settled by the High Court in New York without my physical presence in the courtroom. The judge ruled that the entire remaining liquidity would be deposited into the Evelyn Carter Foundation for Structural Reform, completely separating the assets from the syndicate's historical banking channels. I signed the final acceptance documents on my wooden desk in the Highlands, the mechanical scratch of the fountain pen signaling the definitive end of Adrian's corporate shadow over my life. He had built an empire out of glass and calculation, but his final legacy was a foundation of absolute transparency managed by the woman he had loved. As the autumn of 2026 arrived, the forests surrounding the loch shifted into a brilliant geometry of amber and gold, the falling leaves mirroring the transformation of our inner lives. Luca and I sat by the great hearthfire after a long day of analyzing medieval stone mortar samples from the local abbey project. He pulled me close against his chest, his breath steady and warm against my hair as the winter chill began to settle over the high mountain ridges. We had built our sanctuary out of the ruins of a global conspiracy, proving that the most enduring human connections are those forged in the absolute purity of shared survival. The digital database we established in the Highland Fortress recorded over 1 million access hits from independent researchers during its first 6 months of operation. My mother's original diary was displayed as the central digital manifesto of the site, its opening sentence serving as a permanent warning to the elite gatekeepers of offshore wealth: the truth cannot be liquidated. I looked at the operational networks processing the information with absolute clarity, realizing that her voice was now speaking through thousands of active investigations across the globe. Her absence had been a long, dark winter, but her legacy had finally achieved a permanent, unshakable summer. Regional news correspondent traveled to our estate to conduct a brief interview regarding the long-term impact of the Horizon scandal on luxury art markets. When she asked me if I ever regretted running toward Adrian inside that Parisian elevator 3 years ago, I looked at Luca, who was adjusting the camera equipment nearby, and shook my head. That terrifying apparition was the necessary catalyst that forced me to break out of my velvet cage, I said, choosing my words with clinical precision. It taught me that a life built on beautiful fabrications is simply a more expensive prison, and that true luxury is the sovereign right to live without fear. The structural piece of our life in the Highlands remained unbroken as the final months of 2026 passed into history. Our days defined by an unhurried harmony that required no validation from high society. We had systematically uncovered the dark architecture of the sovereign horizon, survived the lethal operations of Celeste Laurent, and honored the tragic sacrifice of Adrian Vale. We were no longer characters in a psychological thriller running through rain-soaked European streets. We were the absolute rulers of our own peaceful landscape. Our love had successfully completed its hazardous transition, entering a permanent, unshaken state of structural balance. The definitive transition from a hazardous survival alliance into an unshakable state of absolute peace crystallized within the isolated mountain passes of the Swiss Alps, a geographic sanctuary where Luca and I systematically established our permanent research headquarters far beyond the surveillance grid of the remaining corporate elite. The federal international warrants for the secondary actors of the Sovereign Horizon conspiracy were processed by global law enforcement agencies with clinical efficiency, ensuring that the predatory financial architecture Adrian Vale had sacrificed his sanity to expose could never be resurrected by his historical competitors. We sat together within the expansive timber library of a restored 19th-century stone villa, the large panoramic windows framing the jagged snow-covered peaks of the surrounding landscape while the gentle mechanical hum of our independent server networks filled the background with a comforting white noise. The localized warmth of a massive cast-iron wood stove illuminated the stacks of recovered microfilms, the decrypted digital drives, and the original handwritten bank ledgers that my mother had protected with her life before she was forcefully erased from our family history 20 years ago. Luca reached across the heavy oak workstation, his calloused fingers closing over my hand with an authentic protective warmth that signaled the complete emotional resolution of the long psychological war we had waged against the structural ghosts of our past. I looked at the emerald ring resting securely on my finger, realizing that our love had been thoroughly purified in the terrifying shadows of room 714, an impossibly dangerous beginning that had ultimately broken our collective conditioning and guided us toward a sovereign sanctuary of absolute truth. Outside the stone walls, the alpine wind drove the winter mist across the high valleys. But inside the perimeter of our newly constructed reality, the internal friction that had dictated my adult life vanished into a serene state of architectural harmony. We had catalogued every transaction, named every assassin, and repossessed the stolen narrative of our families, transforming a legacy of systemic violence into a quiet, independent empire of truth that no billionaire foundation could ever hope to infiltrate or dismantle. The fourth wall breaks completely with a sudden sharp shift in the auditory environment, the atmospheric sounds of the Swiss alpine wind dissolving instantly into the pristine, echoing acoustics of an elite urban interior. Evelyn Carter appears standing completely alone in the center of the immaculate restored lobby of the Grand Hôtel de l'Opéra in Paris, the heavy gold-trimmed elevators operating behind her in absolute mechanical silence as they ascend and descend through the empty shafts. She is wearing the same elegant dark charcoal overcoat that Adrian Vale wore during their first terrifying confrontation in this exact space. Her physical posture remarkably rigid, yet completely devoid of the panic or the grief that had once defined her movements. In her right hand, she holds the original white plastic hotel keycard from room 714. The dark, sticky residue of dried blood still visible across the embossed serial numbers, but now sealed beneath a protective layer of clear laminating resin like a historical specimen in a museum. Her expression is entirely serene and unreadable, her pale face illuminated by the brilliant symmetrical glare of the overhead crystal chandeliers, which reflect in her wide, calm eyes without a single flicker of uncertainty. She does not look at the grand staircase or the rotating glass doors leading out into the rain-soaked Parisian night, choosing instead to turn her head slowly toward the primary viewpoint, looking directly into the camera lens with an absolute chilling finality that breaks the boundaries between the narrative and the spectator. She raises the bloodied keycard slightly, as if presenting a final piece of unredacted evidence to an invisible jury, her lips parting into a faint phantom smile that acknowledges the completion of her transition from a helpless victim into the sovereign architect of the entire game. The ambient lighting of the grand lobby suddenly drops by half an octave as the internal electrical systems experience a brief controlled power surge, the soft classical music in the background terminating with a low static hiss. The camera remains completely stationary, locking onto her frozen gaze for 5 long suspended seconds of absolute psychological confrontation before the ambient lights of the chandeliers flicker once, and the screen slowly fades to a deep, permanent midnight black.